We'll see how it works. And rotation. And I think it's working. I hope it's working. We'll see if it's working. But I think it's recording. So that was the goal. Oh, yeah. Oh, well. Oh, well. And let's erase it.
Pretty sure you can erase with the eraser.
Okay, well, a couple minutes left. Actually, so how are y'all doing?
Pretty good.
Okay, well, I'm sorry that the first part's a lot of lecture. Like I said, normally we don't have this much discussion. It's just that in the beginning, you have to go through all of what this is about before you start getting the good stuff. Before you start getting into, for instance, how to maximize your process, how to optimize your process. So as a result, well, we've had to talk about more conceptual stuff before we get into the analytical good stuff. But anyway. Saying 7:04 here. So we'll do another. Everybody's here, right? Oops, like maybe more.
No, no, no.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, then if everybody's here. Okay. So, the question was asked, what happens when a business transaction occurs?
Money for service or product.
Money for service or product. So basically what happens is, your company produces some type of product. It can be a good, it can be a service, it can be a promise. And in exchange, people will give you money. So, you have some product offering that's going from you, from your company, to the customer. And in exchange, the customer basically says, here, have my money. It's a good thing, right? So as a result, once we get to this point, well, something to think about. First, what part manages the money? Finance. After all, they're the ones who are basically supplying the money. Now, things being the way they are, it can't be just finance. You also need accountants to make sure to keep everybody honest. Well, as for managing the customer, that's where marketing comes in. After all, you need somebody to make sure that what you're doing and what the customer wants is fairly aligned. Now, what group manages the stuff? That's where operations comes in. So here's a question. What happens when any of these groups fail? They all fail. Basically what happens, suppose the finance guys fail. We have no money. What happens if we have no money? We're bankrupt. What happens if the marketing guys fail? Eventually you'll have no money because you have no customers. You have no customers, you have no money, so it fails. What happens if the operations fail? Well, you have no stuff. So why would the customer be there in the first place? All of a sudden, you're out of business. All of these groups work together in order to keep the business running. So, with this course, what we tend to do is we tend to view operations with the perspective of how it affects the process. Because it's the process that's going to keep us going. The process is what's going to get stuff to the customer. And basically, just about everything in a business can be viewed as a process of some type. Either it's your standard process, a bunch of tasks that you do over and over again, or it's something big, a set of tasks that are completed for a special purpose, like, say, building a building. So, just about everything's a process. What kind of process do we need? Well, sort of depends. After all, there's just about every type of process under the sun that you can think of. A lot of it has to do with what kind of business we're in. And more to the point, how much variability does that business have? Demand variability. Good way of thinking about that. Suppose we make winter coats. So, how's demand been the past few months? Well, unless we're in Alaska or something, not very good. Supply variability. Well, good way of thinking about this. How often does the harvest come in? Sometimes we may have just a huge amount of input that's available. Sometimes we may have almost none. That said, supply variability can take on another form. What kind of quality do we have coming in? What is the quality of our raw materials? High quality? Top notch? Or is it junk? Sometimes junk is good, because junk is usually cheap. And if we can do something with it and make money off it, life is good, right? But in some cases, that variability is something you have to take into account. Process variability. A good way of thinking about this. How long do you think it'll take for you to complete the first homework assignment? You don't know, right? And also, well, another way of thinking about it, how long did it, going back in some cases, if this is your first semester here, way back, how long did it take to complete your last 10 homework assignments? It may have been a couple hours, may have been 20 hours, who knows? So there's some variability there. In the same way with processes, things do not always take the exact same amount of time every time. And that has an effect on what our business does. Product variability. This can get kind of interesting, especially when you consider that sometimes our customers want some customization with their product. Think about the computer you have. What kind, just why did you buy it? Generally, when people buy computers, they have a whole bunch of different things they're looking for. Some people just want something that they can use to check email. Some people want incredibly fast machines so that they can number crunch or maybe play games. Some people want incredible graphics. Generally, when people buy a computer, they're buying it for their own purposes. And as a result, sometimes you have to make different products for those different customers. So in general, when there's very little variability, life is good, life is awesome. Because then you can basically have an assembly line. High productivity, low responsiveness, life is good. On the other hand, the more variability you have. You sort of have to have some more fudge factor in the process. You have to have more responsiveness to the process to take into account this variability. But that is going to have an effect on your labor productivity. So, you have this trade-off. First, labor productivity. In other words, what percentage of our hours or workers are there are actually getting stuff done. And then responsiveness. And this is how well we can respond to changes in demand or production. In other words, how can we respond to variability? In general, these are trade-offs. The higher productivity we have, the less responsive we're able to be. The more responsive we are, the lower labor productivity is. Good way of thinking about it. Do you want a hospital? Or more to the point, do you want a trauma center? Let's be more specific. With 100% productivity, 100% labor productivity. Well, what kind of variability do we have with a trauma center? A lot, Sometimes it may be dead, people are healthy, life is good. And sometimes you may have a whole bunch of people come in, into the ambulance, and they need help. So what happens? All of a sudden the trauma center is swamped. If you have 100% labor productivity, it basically means that you have people waiting. And that's not a good thing, especially when you're dealing with a trauma center. So in some cases, you want to put in a little bit of flexibility to your process so that you're able to deal with these crises, that you're able to respond when all of a sudden things just go wrong. So this productivity and responsiveness trade-off tends to produce a frontier. In some cases, you have a lot of labor productivity. Well, that means that your workers are going to be busy. They're going to have a lot of productivity, but ideally, there better not be a lot of variability in the process. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of wait time. The same way, if you have a responsive process, you're going to have some workers who are idle. You're going to have some workers who are just waiting around. But they're going to be able to respond to the customers as needed. Now, what we really want is to expand that frontier, to basically allow for some case where we don't have this trade-off, where we're able to be more responsive but more productive at the same time. And this is where we get things like mass customization, where you're able to be responsive to the customers, but you're still productive. So, what you don't want is low productivity and low responsiveness, because that's just, it's inefficient. You're basically not using your process to its full capabilities. Now, keep in mind, with a process, we can usually make improvements if it's worth the money. After all, when it comes to any of these things, you have to ask if it's worth the money. The thing is, to improve a process, in some cases to improve its productivity, we need to figure out where and how to improve it. So to that end, this is where we come up with process mapping. We need to map out the process. Now, a good way of thinking about process mapping is it's kind of like learning and converting from one language to another. Because what process mapping does is it takes what's going on and it represents it as a map. This is a lot better than trying to describe verbally what a process is doing. How many of you have ever tried to write instructions for people? Is writing it verbally the best thing to do all the time?
No.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. No. Okay. What is? What's the best way to do this?
Oftentimes showing them how it's done.
Showing them how it's done. Basically, picturing how it's done, because that's a better way of visualizing. Well, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to come up with a picture of what's going on. But as a method of comparison, here's some verbal instructions. These are instructions on how to build a desktop computer. And, well, how much sense does this stuff make? Not a lot, right? Not a lot. So, what if we convert this to something that makes sense from a process perspective? In other words, we translate each of these steps into something we can understand and something we can manipulate and calculate with. That's what process mapping does. Now, with process mapping, there's several symbols we use. We have good old rectangles for tasks and operations. This is when we get stuff done. In some cases, we have decision points. Good way of thinking about this. Suppose we're building cars, and we say, okay, at this point, what color do we want to paint our car? Do we want it red? Do we want it blue? Do we want it green? Do we want it purple? That's a decision point. We have storage areas. This is where we have inventory. Like I said, we need some inventory if our business is to survive. So sometimes we have to store stuff. And of course, we have flows. Flows of material or customers. Basically, flows of people within the process, or flows of what will eventually become product within the process. So, the idea is to represent the process visually so that we can see how these products flow through our process and how it works together, and ultimately where we can improve things. Now, before we go on, we need to think about a few things. What do we look for in this map? We basically need to look for three different things: starting, blocking, and buffering. Now, these three items, they're a little different. How do we think about them? Well, I need to start opening these up. I was so busy looking at what's on the camera that I forgot to open these. Basically, I need one group to act as a volunteer. Anybody? Okay, so y'all's group want to do it? Sure. Okay, well, I first need 4 of you. Just 4. But, well, let's just say it's going to be interesting. And you're probably going to want to clear off some space on the table. The idea is we're going to need 4 students. Now, the other problem was that for some reason, well, the only dice I could find, some of them were colored anyway. So that's variation in raw materials. So basically, supply variation. Pick a color, any color.
Let's go pink.
Pink? Okay. Pick a color. Okay. Pick a color. And now, which of you wants to do it? Well, pick 3. 3 colors. Yeah. Okay. Now, each of you has a group of dice and different color markers. The goal of the process is going to be this: to color each of the sides of these dice a different color. So color as many dice as you can, as fast as you can. Whoops. Now the first process, you're going to color the first, you're going to be first, and you're going to color 3 sides of the die. And then you'll pass it off, you'll color one side, you'll color one side, and you'll color one side. Okay? So you ready? Well, let's begin.
I have to do them all and then.
You have to do, yeah, sorry. You do have to do them all before passing it. Quality issues. So, how busy are y'all? Not doing much, huh? Yeah. So, are you not busy because you're lazy?
I don't have much to do.
There's just not much to do. Exactly. You know, it's not your fault that you're not working. It's that there's just not much work there. So, what do we call this? What we do is we call this starving. Basically, we have, what's happening is, because your throughput rate is a lot slower than everybody else's here, basically, you can't work because there's no work, right? That's what we call starving, when you're not able to work because, well, there's no work to get done. So, when a process is unable to operate at its full capacity, or when a step in a process is unable to operate at its full capacity because a previous step can't keep up, this is what we call starving. And yeah, it's probably a good idea to stop the first process at the moment. If you want to take notes, go ahead. So that's the first one. That is starving, where it's not, it's not their fault that they're not working as fast as they could be. They just don't have the work. Sometimes that happens. A lot of times in a process that happens. So basically, with this starving, they're not working because there's no work for them. It's not their fault. It's that there's a step in a process earlier on that has a smaller throughput rate. So with this case, this step in a process is able to produce 1 pair of glasses a minute. This step in the process is able to work on 2 pairs of glasses in a minute. Are they going to be able to work on 2 pairs of glasses a minute? No. Because this guy isn't going to be able to get it to them. That is starving. Okay, now if you would, could you take 2 of your markers and give them to the last person in the process? Now, in this case, same thing. You're going to color one side. You're going to color one side. You're going to color one side, but this time you're going to color 3. So, similar process, but let's see what happens. looks like you have some work building up back there. So why do you know? And I apologize if I sound like a jerk at this point, because sometimes you will hear stuff like this in the real world. You'll hear people ask, so, why are you working so slowly? You know, they're doing work real fast. They're getting it done. Why aren't you? See the problem? It's not his fault. It's not. In this case, you just have a lot more stuff that you need to get done, a lot more work, and as a result, well, in this case, it's building up. This is what we call a buffer. So, you just have a bunch of dice that's building up here. Basically because your throughput rate is now a lot smaller than everybody else's. The work builds up. As a result, well, the work will continue to build up, or one of two things will happen. Sorry. Suppose I had an infinite number of dice. Would you really want to do this for infinity? Probably not. But what would happen if we kept on doing it for infinity? It would build up forever, right? We keep on building up dice. So, do we have a warehouse where we can store all that dice? Probably not. You know, not one large enough. So eventually you'd have to slow down, right? You'd have to take a break and you'd have to stop. That's the thing about buffers. They can be a temporary solution, but they are never a permanent solution. Eventually, because y'all's throughput rate is greater than yours, you would have to slow down to match his. Doesn't matter whether there's a buffer or not. So with buffering, you know, it's a nice stopgap, but it doesn't work forever. So with buffering, the idea is that we put a storage area between steps of a process so that the output of one stage goes into this temporary inventory step before going on to the next task. And, well, anytime you see a line, anytime you see a queue, whatever you want to call it, that's a buffer. So whenever you're going through the grocery store, know that you're going through a nice little buffer. Because you have a whole bunch of people shopping for groceries. They're going to do their, you know, you're going to get your stuff, and then you're going to go to the checkout line, and you're going to wait. Now, in theory, if the checkout line wasn't there, you could leave, right? Well, they'd probably be a little upset at the shoplifting, but you know, you get the idea. Basically, this is the limiting factor. This is the throughput rate that is basically determining how fast people are able to leave the store. Okay, well, we're going to have a very similar process, but with one little change. What if we're not allowed to hold inventory? In other words, you can't pass it until you're done. You can't pass it until you're done and ready to accept the next one. You can't pass it until you're done and ready to accept the next one. Okay? So, there we go. Okay. And you can begin anytime. Now remember, you can't pass it until the next person can accept it.
So I can still do it.
You can still do it,
But I can't do it before.
but you can't do more. your part and then waiting around, right? You see this a lot with assembly lines. With an assembly line, you can't pass it until the next step in the process is ready to accept it. This is what we call blocking. Basically, you can't work because the stuff you'd normally work on, you're done, but you can't go on because you're being blocked from passing it on. So in this case, because this last step in the process has a much smaller throughput rate, has a much lower throughput rate, well, you're having to spend a lot of time waiting. You're having to spend a lot of time with this finished good in your hands that you can't send on. And that is what we call blocking. Now, it's important to note with the previous example, with the buffering example, eventually we would have been blocked. After all, we can't produce dice forever, because eventually that buffer would have filled up. So with blocking, a good way of thinking about it is that it's when a process is unable to continue working, continue operating, because there's no place to put its finished product. Okay, so we've looked at starving, we've looked at buffering, we've looked at blocking. These three concepts will be important when it comes to figuring out what processes do. Now I'm going to need all five of you, but I'm also going to need one more volunteer to join. Anybody? Okay, well, come on in. This time, spread the markers around. In other words, everyone has one marker. Oh yes, before we go on, these three items, these starving, blocking, this buffering, it basically causes one task to hold all the other tasks back. We call this task bottleneck. And the reason why the bottleneck is important is because of this nice little rule. Basically, you're only as fast as your slowest step. You're only as fast as your slowest step. In other words, to put it more formally, the throughput rate of the process cannot be greater than the throughput rate at the bottleneck. Fun little example. Suppose you're hiking in the woods with a group of people. And suppose I'm one of those people. How fast are you going to hike through the woods? Your speed. My speed, exactly. In other words, as you're going through the woods, you're only going to be as fast as the slowest person there. In the same way with the process, you're only going to be as fast as the slowest step in that process. So, now we get to a fun process. It's all balanced. Each person has one color. Each person has the same amount of work. So in theory, everyone should have about the same throughput rate, right? So this should fly, right? This should be good. Okay, well, I want you to work as fast as you can. Keep on going, okay? And if I say weird stuff during it, don't be surprised. Looks like we're running low there. I can get another shipment in about 2 weeks, okay? That sound good? Probably not. No, probably not, huh? Okay, well, I managed to get a hold. Well, actually, wait a minute. There's a delay, some customs delay. It happens. So, what are you working on? Nothing. Why? Don't have any parts. Don't have any raw materials. And okay, it got through customs, so we're able to get some more. Probably should have brought some weird dice in. Quality issues.
White one. It's like color.
Yeah, well, I apologize for that. One thing I forget is that I need to bring the dice for the first day of class for this, and as a result, well, I basically had to run out and get dice at the last minute, and these were the only ones available. Okay, managed to get another shipment in. And at this point, U.S. Customs says, I'm sorry, you're no longer allowed to import that raw material into the United States. And yes, you'd be surprised how often that happens. I bet you never thought you'd be colored in a grad class, huh?
Not intentionally.
Well, sorry. At any rate, so what happened? What went on here? We had done everything right. We had a nice, balanced process. It was well designed. But there's a problem. The supply of raw materials, the supply of dice, was unreliable. So you couldn't work because you're basically being starved by your supplier. So, this leads to some fun questions. First, is inventory important?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. After all, if you have some inventory built up, well, it's longer before you have to stop because you run out. Is supply chain management important? Oh, yeah. The thing to remember about supply chains. Supply chains are just really, really big processes that a bunch of different companies manage. That's a simple way of thinking about it. You know, it's basically going from dirt, from raw material, all the way to a finished product. And it's basically one big process. So, how do we measure a process? Basically, tend to look at a few things, three main things. First is inventory. A good way of thinking about what inventory is, a more complete definition of what inventory is. It is work in process. How much can this step in the process work on at one time? If we can work on only one at a time, oh, that's cool, that's fine, that's spiffy. But suppose we can work on 20 at a time. Well, that's even better. Going back to our grocery example. How many checkout lanes do we have open? So if we have 5 checkout lanes, we can work on 5 customers at a time. If we have 20 checkout lanes open, we can work on 20 customers at a time. Flow time. This is the time that it takes to go from start to finish. The time from when we start coloring the die to when we finish coloring the die. How long does it take for that one item to go from beginning to end of that step in the process? And then we have throughput rate, or sometimes flow rate. This is churn. This is how fast that step in the process, or the process, is able to deliver output. How fast does it get stuff out? Excuse me. How fast do the dice get done? So why is this important? Sorry, before getting ahead of myself. There are a couple of other measurements that we sometimes see. You'll see inventory turns sometimes when it comes to accounting. How many of you have heard the term inventory turns? A few of you. Basically, the idea here is how often, in a given time period, in a year for instance, the entire contents of inventory are replaced. So, with inventory turns, if we replace all of inventory 10 times in a year, it means our inventory turns are 10. Now, since flow time represents the time spent there, inventory turns is usually the inverse of the flow time. In other words, inventory turns is just 1 over the flow time. Cycle time. What cycle time is it's the time between units leaving the process. In other words, the time from one customer leaving the grocery store to the next customer leaving the grocery store. And this is usually the inverse of the throughput rate. So, we talked about it, throughput rate. I've mentioned this a few times. This is the speed of a process. This is, in some ways, the capacity of the process, how much it can get done. How much product can we churn out in a given amount of time? Now remember, I said the step in the process with the smallest throughput rate is the bottleneck. Now, barring outside influences, things like demand, like supply, the bottleneck will determine the throughput rate of the entire process. It certainly limits the throughput rate of the process. We can't go better than it. We may be able to go worse, but we can't go better than it. So ideally what we want is we want each step to have as close a throughput rate as possible, to have a balanced throughput rate. With our last process, we had each person have color one side. Basically everyone had about as close to the same throughput rate as you can get. The reason why we do this is to avoid starving and blocking. The idea is that everybody has about the same amount of work. Because when it comes to this, there's this nice little relationship. And this is always true. Always. As long as you're using the right numbers, this is always true. And that is, inventory will equal your throughput rate times the flow time. In other words, inventory, and that's a little thicker than I wanted. Let's try this one. Basically, what inventory is amount of stuff we can work on. So if we can work on 10 items at a time, our inventory is 10. Throughput rate. How fast we can get stuff out, can get product out. And then flow time. Flow time is the amount of time for a product. That could be a customer, it could be an item, to go from start to finish. this will always hold. This is a law. It's not a theory. It'll always hold. But sometimes you have to be careful as to what you're using. We'll talk about things like designed throughput rates and actual throughput rates. Design throughput rates are basically how fast a step in the process could go if it wasn't being blocked or starved by anything else. Actual throughput rates are what's actually happening. You know, what a process is doing despite being blocked and starved. There is a difference between the two. And usually what ends up happening is, because the throughput rate is smaller, the inventory is smaller. Basically, the amount that's actually being worked on is smaller. So, what does this mean? Well, what it means, once I erase the board, once you know two of these items, suppose you know the flow time and suppose you know the work in process inventory, you will automatically get the third. The third is given as a result of the first two. In the same way, if we hold throughput rate constant, suppose we want to keep the same throughput rate, the same output. If we can make our process faster, that means that we can use fewer resources and reduce inventory process. At the same time, and this is more often, suppose we can't reduce the flow time. It still takes 9 minutes to bake a loaf of bread. And yeah, that's oftentimes what it took to bake a loaf of bread. If you can't reduce flow time, if you want to increase the throughput rate, you had to increase the work in process inventory. You basically had to commit more resources to that particular step in the process. So, given that, relationship, work in process inventory is equal to flow time times throughput rate. Time to work on a question. At a busy drive-through teller, and yes, there was a place that was almost exactly like this when I was growing up. You basically had 10 cars waiting in line. Oh, sorry, it went forward on me without me wanting to. Sorry. Let's go back to this. There we go. And okay. So 10 cars waiting in line. We have the teller here. Here's a good old bank. And it takes them 5 minutes, on average, to serve one customer. On average, how long will a car wait in line? Basically, from beginning to end. Okay? Okay? You ready? Go to. Explore that thought. Oh well.
inventory is 10. Right?
How long will the car be reliable is so tight?
Yeah, that's what we're looking for. Yep.
So we have
We got the inventory of 10. Just different. We got the throughput rate of 5.
yeah, 10, 5, and we have to make so tight, so 10 over 5.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, it takes the one teller, yeah, on average about 5 minutes to serve one customer. So you have, well, how many people do you have there? 10. Okay. And so you have, so what's the throughput rate?
5 minutes.
Oh, 1 over 5, but yeah.
Yes. So it's
1 over 5. So you have 10 over 1 over 5, which will be 50.
Yep.
You know, it takes 5 minutes for.
He said it.
Okay, so basically, hold on, we have, so inventory 10. And you have, you're basically looking at foot from beginning to end. So
Yeah.
throughput rate, you have a cycle time of 5 minutes, it's every 5 minutes. So the throughput rate is 1 over.
Oh,
So what's the time from beginning to end?
What was the question?
What's the time to go from beginning to end?
Yeah, 50 minutes.
Because per person it's 5 minutes. Second person's 10 minutes. First person's 15 minutes. So you
Yeah.
can add 5 minutes for each person.
Okay.
And then all of the minutes total.
I don't even know what inventory is half hour.
That's what I
Yeah.
got.
What's the, and then we have a little 5.
Well,
What is right first?
I'm going to ask a group to present,
Oh, okay.
and then I'll give the summary of what's going on. Okay?
Yeah, but it's always.
Okay, so,
One that you're going to be part-time.
so any volunteers on presenting their answer?
We already know.
Going once, going twice? Anyone want to present? Bueller? Bueller? Sorry. Okay. Well, I guess I could go with the good old random number generator if need be.
I can present it.
Okay, well, come on up.
Start writing.
Yeah.
So the goal, total weight, known is average 10 cars at a time and 5 minutes per car. So the method would be 10 cars times 5 minutes per car. 50 minutes.
And that is correct. Good job. Thank you. Okay. Tough crowd. Anyway, that's exactly right. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. One is the way that most people would look at this, and that is they'd start counting. You know, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. That's one way. The other way is to look at it through Little's Law. Little's Law, well, this 5 minutes right here, this is basically a cycle time. And we have an inventory of 10. Now, cycle time is 5 minutes per car. So the inverse of that, which is our throughput rate, is going to be 1/5 car per minute. So this is our throughput rate. And going by Little's Law, which is basically I equals RT, inventory equals throughput rate times flow time. Well, 10 equals 1/5 times flow time. We do the math, we find the flow time is equal to 50 minutes. Good job, by the way. Very good job. I use this as a demonstration to show, yeah, this works. Little's Law is always a law. It's always going to work. As a result, well, it can help us when we're trying to figure out what's going on with the process, what a process should be doing, and what a process is doing. Okay, I think it's time for another break, right? Yeah, well, let's take a break. And what time is it now? About 8. Let's go 8:15, okay? Okay? Okay. Yeah.
No, I
Okay, and $8:15. And yeah, looks like we're going to go the full 3 hours today. Okay. Show. Yeah, that'll go fairly quickly. But yeah, I don't think we're going to get through all of week 1 this week. But that's okay. That's okay. One of the things I was glad for in regards to the move, the problem with this particular demonstration with the dice is that at the end of the class, what you have is a whole bunch of dice. What do you do with all this dice? And you can only use this once. You know, it's not like you can reuse them over and over again, because once they're colored, it's kind of hard to uncolor them. So, well, basically when it came to the move, I ended up throwing away a couple hundred dice, simply because I didn't know where to put them. If anyone wants dice, by the way, you can have them, please.
Use a driving race. I didn't watch them
Oh.
Next time?
Yeah, I could, couldn't I? Yeah. Yeah, I could. Yeah. Thank you.
Cheaper.
Very true. Okay, well, I guess the problem was I found all of these nice little colors and all of that. Yeah. Okay, well, I'll be back in a minute.
get. It's kind of a
Yeah.
producing
Yeah.
Because you never know how much basketball.
Yeah, like that freshman year.
No, it was, he just says he's
I
doing
never
something.
finished that like junior year.
He was really good. Did you see his movie? When,
Oh my god.
I don't want to.
You're graduating class
Yeah. They'll probably win again this year. I didn't get hurt.
Yeah. I've been like an entire year.
It's a big body. His wrinkle runs more.
Like she is kind of year, right after we graduated. Yeah. We only need 10 classes. And she did the 2 that we need to go over stuff. Yeah, it's only 20 minutes. Plus 2 readings.
that your professor has lost his mind. Okay. I have a coffee maker in my office. And shortly before this class, there were a few things I needed to get done. You know, I needed to print out the video sheet, for instance. And so started the coffee maker, got it going. And, you know, did a couple other things, and then basically went up here to class. And forgot the coffee. Now, where things get interesting is, after the second hour, I decided to go back and get a cup of coffee. So first thing I'm doing is I'm going and looking, okay, you know, where's my coffee cup? And I see, hey, it's right there. And so I start another cup of coffee, even though this was already about 2/3 full. Guess what happens when, what's basically 2/3 plus 2/3?
More than 3/3.
1 3/3, or more to the point, 1 and a mess. So I was busy cleaning up after myself. After my cup overflowed. Okay, well, I don't know how much longer we're going to go today. Quite obviously, I have lost my mind. And from empirical evidence, after about 2 hours, just about any undergrad has lost their mind, too. Usually, grad students have a little more tolerance because, well, we do meetings. And let's face it, meetings are several hours of trying to look interested while not really being interested, correct? Okay, well, let's see how far we go. And how many of you have ever seen the movie Back to School? Okay, a couple. You know, it's sort of a generational thing, right? The history professor was described as committed. The response, of course, was, by whom we have no idea. If it gets to the point where it looks like I need to be committed, let me know, okay? At any rate, well, let's go with this example here. We have a discount optical shop here. And basically we have 5 steps. Once a customer comes in, you have somebody there to greet the patient. You know, to basically say, hi, here's some insurance forms to fill out. You know, all that fun stuff. And we have one person there. You know, we can take care of one customer at a time. And it takes about 2 minutes. Then, well, we have the eye exam. With the eye exam, well, that takes a while, right? You know, you have to put this thing in front of you and they flip all these lenses to see what your prescription is, right? And that takes about 25 minutes. And we only have one optometrist on staff, so we can only do one customer at a time. So then we have frame and lens selection. You know, you look at all the frames that are available, and you decide, okay, I like these, I don't like these, you know, these look weird on my face, you know, that sort of thing. And that takes about 20 minutes. And we have one person there, so we can serve one customer at a time. Now, once we actually start making the glasses, we can make 6 glasses at a time. However, it takes about an hour. Then once that's done, we have a final fitting. You know, they bend this wire, they bend that wire, and that takes about 5 minutes. So we have 5 steps. We have an inventory for each of them. You know, 1 for most of them, 6 for that glasses made step. And we have a flow time for each of them, anywhere from 2 minutes to 60 minutes. So what we can then do is we can use Little's Law to calculate the throughput rate for each of these. You have the inventory, you have the flow time, you can calculate the throughput rate. So for greeting the patient, we have one customer, takes 2 minutes. Throughput rate, half a customer a minute. We have the eye exam. One customer, takes 25 minutes. So our throughput rate is 0.04 customers a minute, and so on and so forth. So, given this is how we calculate it. We have a flow time here, how long it takes from start to finish. So, with the glasses made step, that takes 60 minutes. It takes an hour. But we can work on up to 6 glasses at a time. So, as long as we're not being starved or blocked, and yes, that is important, our inventory is 6. As a result, we can find the throughput rate for this step. So, throughput rate is just going to be inventory divided by flow time, 6 divided by 60, or 0.1. So, and yeah, I'm going to say this a lot, assuming the task isn't starved or blocked, this task can produce 0.1 glasses a minute, or 1 pair of glasses every 10 minutes. So here's our process. We have each of these steps here, and we have their throughput rates. Read and register the patient. We can take care of basically 1/2 of glass a minute. Conduct eye exam, 0.04 glasses a minute. So, given this process, what's the bottleneck? Conduct the eye exam, exactly. And that also limits the throughput rate for the process. Basically, we can't do better than 0.04 glasses a minute. But there is some things to think about. We can improve things sometimes. For instance, suppose we wanted to improve the glasses made step. Decide to expand the amount that we can work on. So instead of 6 glasses at a time, we can work on 10 glasses at a time. Well, that increases our throughput rate, gets it up to 0.167 glasses a minute. We can do that. Does it help us? Not really. At least not yet. The reason why is because of this step right here. Basically, we cannot do better than the bottleneck. And because we can't do better than the bottleneck, what is the only step we can improve that's actually going to improve our process? The bottleneck. So, when it comes to these things, because the throughput rate is basically the minimum of the throughput rates for each of the steps, that bottleneck is what's going to keep us from going any faster. And that's what's going to tell us how fast we can go. So, if we can only produce, if that step can only produce 1 pair of glasses every 25 minutes, what are we going to produce? 1 pair of glasses every 25 minutes. At most, 1 pair of glasses every 25 minutes. So, given what you see of this, does it sound like a good thing? Does it sound like a good process? Oh, I don't know. There's some parts we can and probably should improve. Ideally, what we want to do with the process is to balance it, so that each step of the process has as close to a throughput rate as possible. We'll call it a DICE example. We want every step in the process to have about the same amount of work, or more to the point, have about the same throughput rate. So how can we do this? Well, we can add people or redistribute them, maybe combine parts of the process. There's lots of little different things we can do to improve the process. So in this case, suppose we decide to add 2 people to the process. Where do we add them? Well, basically, you always work with the bottleneck. Now, there is one caveat to this. The bottleneck may change as a result of what we do. In other words, if we improve one step, that step may no longer be the bottleneck. For instance, suppose we decide to hire a second optometrist so that we can have 2 people working the eye exam. So we can basically have that step producing 2 glasses at one time. Flow time is still 25 minutes. So our new throughput rate is going to be 0.08 glasses a minute. And like I said, you can only help the process by improving the bottleneck, because it's the bottleneck that limits the throughput rate of the process. Helping anywhere else isn't going to help us. So what we seek to do is we aim for whatever process has the minimum throughput rate. That's what's going to help us. So we've added 1 person to the conduct eye exam case. So how fast can a process go? Yeah, all of a sudden we have a new bottleneck, don't we? We improve the conduct eye exam step, but now we have a new bottleneck in frame and lens selection. As a result, we have a throughput rate of 0.05 glasses a minute. So where do we add the second person? We added at the new bottleneck. So we add a second person at frame and lens selection and improve that. So we have a new inventory there. We can work on up to 2 people at a time, 2 sets of glasses at a time. And that gives us a new throughput rate of 0.1 glasses a minute there. So we have now added 2 people. What's our new throughput rate? 0.08, exactly. Our bottleneck is now the conduct eye exam step again. But you'll notice our process is a little more balanced now. You know, these 3 steps are more or less the same in terms of throughput rate. You know, conduct eye exam is 0.08, frame and lens selection is 0.1, glasses made is 0.1. That's fairly well balanced. You know, the other 2 steps, the final fitting and greet the patient, you know, what can you do? You know, sometimes you can't get things perfect. In some cases, we may not want them perfect. You know, consider the greet the patient step. How do you feel going into an office when you go in and nobody recognizes you? Nobody says hi. Nobody says, I'll be with you in a moment. You know, maybe a little bit of responsiveness rather than efficiency is a good idea here. It all depends on what you need to do with the process. So, in general, what you want to do to increase the efficiency of a process is increase utilization. Now, what utilization is, at its heart, is basically for the total actual throughput rate over design throughput rate. That's true for each step. And if you're dealing with a process, it's basically the average of all the people there. So, what percentage of time are your people actually working? Good way of thinking about this. We go back here. Conduct eye exam has throughput rate of 0.08 glasses a minute. Register the patient has a design throughput rate of 0.5 glasses a minute. Are they going to be able to produce half a person a minute, actual time? Probably not. Because they're basically going to be blocked by all of these other steps. So what's going to happen is they'll work for a couple minutes. They'll greet the patient, get him signed in, and then they'll wait. They'll do nothing. That's what a low utilization is. So what causes utilization? Well, anything that produces idle periods. Scheduled downtime. You know, how often do you get an email from IT saying, we need to upgrade the system, so it's going to be down for a few hours? happens, right? What happens to productivity during that time? Well, it goes downhill because all of a sudden, you can't connect with the people you work with, at least not very well. Breakdowns. If things break down, well, what happens? All of a sudden, you have no work to do. Think of an assembly line when all of a sudden the assembly line shuts down. Setup and changeover. Sometimes you need to change equipment. Sometimes you need to go from making one product to another product. Like I said, for a few years, I made bakery equipment. And occasionally they would need to change out various things within the process. Basically, suppose they wanted to change one bag out and put another in because they were making a different product. Well, what they would use to keep from shutting down the entire process was something called a variable capacity accumulator. Good way of thinking about this. Imagine a nice little curved conveyor belt that normally would look like it was only maybe 10 feet in length overall. But then, if it turned on, all of a sudden it would get longer and longer and longer so that it was basically 50 to 60 feet in length. So it could store product as needed without sending it on. So it was, if you will, a temporary buffer. That was to keep it from going idle. That was to keep it from having to shut down. And then, of course, we have our old friends starving and blocking. If a process is being starved, there's no work for it to do. If it's being blocked, there's no place for the work to go. All of these things reduce the amount of time that a step in the process is actually able to work. So, what do we need to do? We need to reduce these idle periods somehow. We need to reduce this downtime. We need to reduce the starving and blocking. And the idea, we need to look at how much time an activity is actually active, a step in the process is actually working, and compare it to the overall time available. Now, I've said two of the main rules so far. First rule, Little's Law. Inventory equals flow time times throughput rate. I've said the second law. You're only as fast as your slowest man. In other words, the step in the process with the smallest throughput rate is your bottleneck, and that's going to limit the throughput rate for your entire process. So now we get to the third rule. The third rule is that units matter. When we compare these steps in the process, we have to make sure that we're comparing identical items. In other words, we have to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. Suppose we have the following example here. In one case, we have a tire manufacturer, and they're able to make 4 tires a minute. And of course, we have a car manufacturer, and the car is able to that car manufacturer is able to manufacture 2 cars a minute. Which of these is the bottleneck? The tires. Why? Exactly. When you're comparing these steps, you have to make sure that you're using the same units. Because 4 tires, or if you're dealing with a spare 5 tires, go into one car, that makes this, and that's, okay, that makes this basically one car per minute. So, since we have 1 car a minute for the manufactured tire step and 2 cars a minute for the manufactured car step, the smallest of these is going to be the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the manufactured tire step. This is one of those words of warning. And that is, you have to make sure that you're using the same units, that you're comparing apples to apples. This can get really confusing. And there's another example as to why. Suppose, well, how many of you have been to Subway lately? You know, it's been a few weeks, but yeah. Did you get your sub toasted? Nope. Anyone normally get their sub toasted when they go to Subway? A few people, right?
Yes.
So here's the problem. If not everything goes through the toasting step, how do you compare the throughput rate for that toaster to the other steps in the process? It can have a smaller throughput rate than the other steps, right? It can have a smaller throughput rate than the put on meat step, and then the put on veggie step, and still be okay. Because not everything goes through that step. So, because you have those issues with the bottleneck, that sometimes, even though it may look like the same units, it's not really. Basically, when it comes to a process, you have to make sure that all of them are basically in units in items completed by the process, by the whole process, per unit time. Sometimes this is straightforward. Occasionally it's not. And then you have to be careful if it's not. So like I was saying, because the manufactured car step has this smaller throughput rate, because the manufactured car step has larger throughput rate, let me start over. Because the manufactured tire step, there's 4 tires to the car, basically means that there's a smaller throughput rate even though there's a larger number. The point is this: units matter. You rarely have a number that's just a number. And as a result, when it comes to these processes, you have to make sure that you're dealing with the same things and that you're comparing the same things. Okay, come on. There we go. Now, another fun example. Suppose we have a process to customize cars, or more to the point, manufacture cars. First we make the car, half car a minute, and then we have this decision. Do we customize the car or no? 60% of customers want the car customized. Now the customized car step, we can deal with 0.35 cars a minute. And then, regardless of whether or not it's customized, it's delivered to the customer. And that has a throughput rate. Now, if you're just looking at the numbers, what looks like the bottleneck here? Customized car step. The problem is, because only 60% of our product goes through this customized car step, we have to adjust for that throughput rate to basically allow it to be, if you will, completed cars a minute. So the throughput rate with regard to the entire process here, is going to be 0.35 divided by 0.60. And thus, by doing this adjustment, we're basically converting from cars per minute to, if you will, completed cars per minute. What we find is that by making this conversion, our process, the step in the process, is actually able to, I went backwards. Oh well. Fair is human. To really mess things up requires a computer. Okay, let me go back. Okay. There we are. So, because of this conversion, because we have to basically put everything in terms of completed cars in it. In other words, the cars completed by the entire process, then we find that it's actually the manufactured car step that's our bottleneck. So the third rule, compare apples to apples. Okay, what time is it, by the way? 8:40. Okay. Considering what I know of what's left, let me lecture for about 10 more minutes, and then let's call it a night, okay? I could have some problems to work on, but let's just lecture and get it done, okay? Okay, we'll work on the problems beginning of next week, okay? And what we're dealing with here is the fourth rule. You recall I started with 4 rules. 1, Little's Law. 2nd, you're only as fast as your slowest step. 3rd, apples to apples. This last one we're going to study in more depth over the next few weeks, but it's a good idea to get the basics down tonight. And that is this. The more variation within a process, the more uncertainty within a process, the worse that process performs. And the reason why is very simple. You can't put time in inventory. Once time is gone, it's gone. And as a result, if you're all of a sudden, if for a little bit you're going slower and then you're going faster, just because you're going faster doesn't mean that everybody else is. So that time is lost anyway. To demonstrate this, let's have a perfectly balanced process. Absolutely, positively, perfectly balanced. Each step in the process can process 5 items per hour. So each hour, step 1 will get 5 items done. Each hour, step 2 will get 5 items done. Each hour, step 3 will get 5 items down. It's perfect. It's awesome. It's great. It's spiffy. And we're just going to add a little bit of variation to it. The variation is here. Step 2 has a little problem. For 1 hour, it can only produce 4 per hour. However, they say that they're going to make it up. They're going to make up for it by producing 6 in the following hour. So what's our average? Our average is still 5, right? We've just added a little bit of variation. So what happens? Well, step 1 produces its 5. Step 2 only produces 4, so it's left with 6 in its inventory. Step 3, well, they only have 4 to work on, but they've done the 5 that were in its inventory from the previous hour. So, step 2 only sends 4 items to step 3. But, like I said, step 2 plans on making up for it. They're going to do 6 in the following hour. So it did 6 in the following hour. The problem is step 3 was just a little bit starved, because they only got 4 in the previous hour, right? So they only had 4 to work on. So step 3 was only able to produce 4 units. So, in the following hour, how much is step 3 going to get done? 5. Because they're producing 5 an hour. So, step 3 basically produces only 5, and that 1 that we couldn't get done, it's lost. Again, we can't put time in inventory. As a result, if we have variation, it will reduce our overall throughput rate for the process. Now, there are some caveats. Variation does allow buffering to have some use. After all, if we have a temporary buffer, all of a sudden we can put a little more in inventory so that if step 3 all of a sudden goes faster, it can work. But that's the point, that if you have this variation, you're going to lose time. You're going to lose capability for your process. So, because of these moments when parts of the process are starved or blocked because of variation, a process that has uncertainty will inevitably have a smaller overall throughput rate than if you just calculated the average. So, uncertainty is bad for a process. Now, just a little summary. Remember what a process is. Basically, you take inputs and transform them into outputs. Just about everything in a business can be viewed as a process or a project, which is basically a specialized kind of process. Basically, we need to look at productivity and responsiveness with our process. Sometimes we want a responsive process, which is basically going to have us have a lower utilization. The question is, what do our customers want? Do they want a responsive process or do they want cheap? You know, if they want cheap, then we're going to give them an assembly line. If they want a lot more customer service, a lot more customization, then that means more responsiveness. How we look at processes are to represent them as a process map. And, well, we draw out the map and we see what's causing the blocking and starving. What is our bottleneck? And remember, the throughput rate of the entire process cannot be greater than the throughput rate at the bottleneck. It can be less, but it cannot be greater. And of course, we have Little's Law. Inventory equals throughput rate times flow time. So once you have 2 of these, usually you'll have inventory, you'll have flow time, you'll have the third. And what we want to do is we want to balance the process so that you don't have utilization that's... You basically want utilization relatively high throughout the process. Okay, that was about 10 minutes, right? Okay. I think it's a good idea for you to start reading the first chapter in the book. That has the basics as to operations management. A question. Does anyone have the second edition of the book rather than the third edition? Basically, this is what the third edition looks like, and this is what the second edition looks like. Second edition, you can get by with the second edition, but some of the, basically all the problems in here that I'm using in here are still in here, but you have to look around to see which is which, basically. But anyway, other than that, it's a good idea to look at the syllabus, just so you know, and I say we call it a night. Okay, I'm ready to be committed. And I will see you next Tuesday. Okay, you have an answer.
The international thing.
Cool.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Gonna work? Okay.
Well, let me tell you a story. When I was an MBA student, several of my international colleagues basically realized a fun, fundraiser for the MBA Association on campus. And that was to sell books for the third term that were the international version. Of course, the international version is a lot cheaper, right? So
All right, so it's good, it's not going to be different then.
it's not going to be different.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, I can't believe I did that with the coffee maker.
Do you want these anywhere in particular?
I'll take care of them. Yeah. Yeesh.
Have a good night.
You too. Okay.
Had to adjust the table.
Yeah, there have been a few like that.
The cheater tolerance, you gotta unscrew the bottom to get it to
Yeah.
all four legs.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, have a good week.
You too?
Good job today.
I don't know about that.
Did. You got my attention.
Okay.
I'm saying something.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, I made a mess of today. But, oh well. Okay, well. Stop capture.